we've been lately looking at the factors that go into modifying the way our body fat is acting. And I think you'll be surprised at what I'm about to show you. I have nothing to disclose. As a humble professor, there's not much for me to talk about in that regard. Many of you have seen this idea before, or if you haven't, you have somewhat gotten the vague impressions of it. There are two key theories with regards to why we are overweight. On one hand, and the one that certainly predominates our cultural psyche, we are overweight because it is strictly a consequence of a caloric imbalance. On the other hand, it's that there is an imbalance in hormones, in particular the hormone insulin. Now, both of these theories, the caloric and the endocrine theory, account for energy that comes in, and both of them account for energy that comes out. And on the caloric side, however, it's just as simple as that. You use it or you store it, and if you're taking in more than you're using, well, then the outcome is as you'd expect. The organism is taking in more energy, and in the case of the human, we're getting fatter. On the endocrine side, it's slightly more complicated. It assumes that we are not perfect thermodynamic machines. Energy must be told what to do, like a naughty little kid. And in this case, among many hormones, insulin really does stand above the rest. And when insulin is elevated over normal sort of baseline homeostatic levels, insulin will tell the system, tell the adipocyte specifically, expand the influx of energy and reduce the efflux of energy. And as you would expect, if you're pouring more water into a sink and blocking up the drain, the system gets bigger on that side as well. So with these two specific theories, there is some overlap insofar as both of them account or have to account for calories. And so there's some overlap, and many people would be willing to admit that degree of overlap. And on the caloric side, the story begins and ends with storing it or using it. That is, a purist when it comes to thermodynamics would say the energy has to be stored or used, and thus there has to be a perfect accounting of it. You can almost tally it up. However, what I'm going to show you, and why this might be a little provocative, is that the endocrine theory actually encompasses, I would say, almost all of the caloric theory. And that's why you can be an endocrine theory advocate and really what I'm going to show you is have some wonderful defense against someone who tries to beat you over the head with the idea that it's just a pure numbers game. It's not really. But as the caloric theory is somewhat encompassed in the endocrine theory, that means the endocrine theory has to, in and of itself, account for some storage and usage of energy. And it does, as I'll show you. Part of how it does that is the nature of our fat tissue. So here are the players. I'm telling you a story. These are the characters in the story. The liver is a very important character in anything metabolic and beyond, mind you. And then two types of body fat that all humans have: white adipose tissue and brown adipose tissue. And in fact, it actually looks like that. It is really white or it is quite brown when you pull it out of a human or any other mammal. And then the other two characters you're all very familiar with: the hormone insulin, and then the molecule I'm just going to call it ketone, but the ketones. Now they're not the same. Insulin's a hormone, and ketone is a metabolite, but they're remarkably related. And again, this is an audience that's very familiar with that. So let's look at adipose tissue first. White adipose tissue is concerned with storing energy. Brown adipose tissue is interested in thermoregulation. In other words, if brown adipose tissue has its way, it's doing nothing but creating heat. And this is something, then when we look at them, they're quite contrasting. On one hand, white adipose tissue wants to store energy. And then on the other hand, we have this other adipose tissue, brown adipose, that wants to use it. But appreciate that in the typical caloric model, we consider energy use as something really that just the muscles are doing. But I'm telling you, there's a type of fat tissue that we all have that actually is also interested in just using energy. So white adipose is storing it, brown adipose is using it. And babies have a lot of brown adipose tissue. I have 3 little kids now, and it's been interesting for me to see over time when they get out of the bathtub, when they're brand new little babies, infants, they don't shiver. Have you noticed that? Little babies don't shiver. They don't need to. We need to shiver because we need to, our muscles, when they shiver, they create heat. That's shivering-induced thermogenesis. When you have, as a baby, especially an infant, has a lot of brown fat, that brown fat is keeping them sufficiently warm that there's no shivering required. But of course, as they start to get a little older, the brown fat starts to diminish. And sure enough, by the time we become even kids and aging up towards adulthood, that shift, there's a shift happening. And relatively less of our fat is brown fat, and more of our fat is the storage white adipose tissue. And thus, if we're cold, we start to shiver. There has been some debate in the field with regards to this relevance in adult humans. But let me be clear. We have brown fat tissue, and it is relevant. It is more active in some people. It can be induced to be more active in some people. Regardless, if you have more of it and it's more active, you're going to be in a good place metabolically speaking. So brown adipose tissue is unique because in fact, it looks brown because it is enriched, with other things, with mitochondria. And as you know, mitochondria is the site of, as has been talked about several times at this meeting already, oxidation of nutrients, glucose or lipids. What the mitochondria are doing in brown adipose tissue, though, is unique. But all mitochondria have a capacity to do two types of things. And so on one hand, the mitochondria will pull in glucose, and it will only use as much glucose as it needs for the work that the cell is requiring the energy for. Does that make sense? The cell has a certain need for energy, and then it will take in only as much nutrient, glucose in this case, in the particular case of the brown adipocyte. It'll pull in only as much glucose into the mitochondria as it needs for the work to get done. In contrast, mitochondria also have the ability to pull in glucose and use it to produce nothing but heat. And it will just continue to produce heat. And so it's like you just keep throwing logs onto the fire. What is producing this heat is something called the uncoupling protein, or UCP1. All mitochondria have, to some degree, this protein. So if uncoupling protein has its way, it's starting to produce a lot of heat from the mitochondria. But as you can see, if we're wanting the fire to get bigger and bigger and bigger, the fuel is glucose, so our glucose starts to come down. Because we're using it all. It's like our wood stack as we're throwing it more into the fire. We're going through that much more faster than normal. And in a mammal, in a human, if glucose starts to come down, that of course is going to affect insulin. And what happens to insulin? Well, of course it starts to come down. We have less need to increase insulin to try to bring it out of the blood. The mitochondria are already doing it. And this overall series of events, more uncoupling protein in mitochondria, resulting in this subtle increase in heat, sometimes imperceptible, mind you, in the body. It's not like you're trying to tear your clothes off, you're so hot. But this results in a reduction in blood glucose because we have a sink, we have a place to dump the glucose, a reduction in insulin, and overall creating a very metabolically favorable milieu. The body is becoming less resistant to obesity and more resistant to diabetes and conditions of insulin resistance. So back to the liver. The liver is a site of tremendous flux, converting nutrients into other nutrients. And at the heart of this is the molecule acetyl-CoA. And again, you've already seen this if you hadn't seen it before. Acetyl-CoA is at the branch point of many, many nutrients. Nutrients turning into acetyl-CoA or acetyl-CoA turning into nutrients. All of them, amino acids, glucose, fatty acids. In the case of what the liver is going to do with acetyl-CoA, liver is going to dictate that in a large way. There are other hormones that come into play, but insulin stands, again, above the rest. Now, as a reminder, acetyl-CoA is a metabolite of the breakdown of both fats and glucose. So just keep that in mind. If insulin is high, it wants to turn acetyl-CoA into lipid. So whatever source the acetyl-CoA was, or wherever we got that from, if insulin is up, it's activating an overall series of events that is pushing acetyl-CoA into lipogenesis, creating new fats from the liver. If, in contrast, insulin is low, then we have a very different outcome. And in this case, we have this unique production of ketones. Insulin is a potent inhibitor of ketogenesis. And let me be clear, this is a pathway that is never resistant. You can have the most profoundly insulin-resistant individual on the planet. Insulin will still act in this pathway and inhibit ketogenesis. But in this case, I'm saying insulin is low in an insulin-sensitive individual. Insulin's low. ketogenesis is happening. So we start producing ketones. And so let's take these two key players and then put them in the spectrum of what it's going to do, or put them in perspective with regards to its actions on fat tissue. And these are the little bubbles of adipocytes, or fat cells, if you will. So the first question we asked in my lab, what is the effect of insulin on the nature of adipose tissue? And so what I'm going to show you on the first hand, we increased insulin, and if we increase insulin, what's going to happen to ketogenesis and ketone levels? Of course, it's going to plummet. Good students. So the first study was inducing hyperinsulinemia in a mouse model. And what we found immediately, so let me take you through this. This figure is firstly just looking at the mass, the growth of the fat pads over this 4-week of induced hyperinsulinemia. And just like humans, mice have very distinct depots, or places of fat tissue. The perirenal is a typical visceral fat. The inguinal on the mouse is a subcutaneous fat that's right beneath the skin. And then the interscapular is the mouse's site of true brown fat. And then the humans, as you could see in that one image I showed you earlier, although I didn't highlight it, that's sort of where we are carrying it, in our thoracic cavity. What you'll see is that hyperinsulinemia in the animals increased the perirenal, the visceral, and the subcutaneous fat, but it had no effect at expanding the overall mass of the typical brown fat, that prototypical brown fat site in the animal, just like in the human, around the thoracic cavity. And that inguinal site in the animal, as I said, is comparable to the human subcutaneous. And what's so remarkable about that is our subcutaneous fat in most people is our greatest site of fat storage. And in humans, our subcutaneous fat, as you can see from the study, that subcutaneous fat that is classically considered white can in fact start to shift over to be more brown, and thus more metabolically active as it starts chewing through glucose to just produce heat. And I didn't mention it earlier, but that's called I indicated it on the arrow, but that's uncoupling. So it's increasing the degree to which the mitochondria are uncoupled. It's pulling apart the need to use energy just for the sake of getting work done. Now, then we looked at what insulin was doing to the actual effect, to the mitochondrial physiology. And so in this case, I'll just simply state these two figures that you see on top and bottom in the middle of the screen. This is us actually looking at the rate at which the mitochondria are using oxygen. This is metabolism, if you will, in its purest form, the degree to which mitochondria are using oxygen. And so you'll see that in the white adipose tissue, insulin did nothing to the mitochondria. There was very low rates of respiration. The mitochondria in the white adipose tissue were already using very little oxygen, and insulin didn't do anything to it. And then further to the right of that, you'll see UCP1. This is us actually measuring the amount of that UCP1 protein. And you'll see that it's a big blank space all across. There was no effect. It was already very little or almost undetectable, and insulin didn't do anything to it, good or bad, from what we could tell. In contrast, when we looked at what insulin was doing to brown adipose tissue, we saw, as you can see, the black bars compared to the white bars in that bottom figure, insulin brought down the degree to which the mitochondria are using oxygen. And this was in brown fat tissue. This is a tissue that is designed to have a high rate of mitochondrial respiration. And if you look a little further, you'll see the first two in uncoupling of the UCP1. The animals that just got the PBS injections, that's just a control, a saline solution. They had high levels of uncoupling protein in their brown fat. And then as you go over to the right a little bit, you'll see that is greatly dropped. The uncoupling protein was just plummeted in the brown fat tissue in these hyperinsulinemic animals. Then we looked at the actual metabolic rate. We put the animals in metabolic chambers and measured what's called indirect calorimetry. And we found that over 4 weeks, that at the beginning both animals had comparable levels of respiration rates, or of metabolic rate. And then after 4 weeks, the insulin brought that metabolic rate down significantly. Wait for the human evidence to support that. I'll show you that in the end, or in just a bit. So overall, this study, and we have more data, we'll submit it soon, this is overall suggesting a shift, that the brown adipose tissue is starting to behave more like white adipose tissue. Thus, we start to see an overall shift where we're promoting an environment, a metabolic environment, that is favoring storage and is inhibiting use, all because of insulin. Now we asked the flip side, the other question. we say, what happens if we increase ketones? And so, and if I want to increase ketones in a mammal, what do I have to do to insulin? I have to flip it around. And we did this one in rats. And note, as evidence of just how different rodents and humans are, if you were wondering, and it's something we always do need to keep in mind, and I, of course, keep in mind as a scientist, look what we have to do to a rat to put it into ketosis. 1% carbohydrate. So just appreciate that. When we try to apply rodent studies and a high-fat diet in a mouse caused obesity, yeah, boy, these mean different things as we go across the mammals and species. But nonetheless, we put the animals into ketosis with an incredibly high-fat ketogenic diet. Now, many of you probably know why a high-fat, low-carb diet is ketogenic, but let me just pretend some of you don't, being a good professor. This is a study looking at the consumption of these very extreme versions of macronutrients in humans: pure lard, pure carbohydrate, pure protein. And you'll see what insulin is doing, how the insulin response is in each of these instances. Protein's having a modest effect, increasing, and it would depend on the protein, just like it would depend on the type of carbohydrate. But whereas protein has a modest insulin effect, carbohydrate has a substantial insulin effect. And then you can't even see the insulin effect to lard because it's just humming along at zero. So pure fat as it is ingested orally. Now, mind you, in nature, we wouldn't typically, this crowd is different, you wouldn't typically be eating pure fat. But if you eat pure, some do, and that's great. But if you eat pure fat, there is not an insulin effect from that pure fat. That's why when it is a low-carb, high-fat diet, it's all about keeping insulin low. And you're providing calories to the body, but not sufficient to increase insulin. Thus, it is a so-called ketogenic diet. So that's what we did to these rats. And this is a very, very new data, literally within the past couple weeks. We pulled the inguinal fat pads, the subcutaneous fat from the rats, and we looked at the mitochondria from the rats. And you'll notice the black bars, the ketogenic diet-fed animals versus the standard chow-fed, the white bars. You'll see that the mitochondria in this subcutaneous white fat from the rats shifted. And you see that the mitochondria are acting, they're much more active. They're using much more oxygen. And then if you'll notice on the bottom with that Western blot, it's subtle, it's a little hard to see, but UCP1 started to climb. That it was almost undetectable in the subcutaneous fat of the standard chow-fed rats, and now all of a sudden we start to see it's blossoming, it's growing. The protein is starting to be expressed, and that's likely what's driving this increased rate of respiration in this white fat tissue. Thus, it's shifting the white fat to be more like brown fat. Now, we then went a little further, and this is very recent. We actually grew fat cells in petri dishes, in culture. So we did a cell culture of fat cells to just look, is this happening just at the level of the fat cell, or is it needing to happen in a whole organism? Do we need the interaction of other tissues? So in this case, we grew the fat cells across a dish, and we increased the ketones by simply feeding them beta-hydroxybutyrate. Now, mind you, something that's interesting, in any lab that has ever worked with adipocytes knows, you actually can't grow fat cells, you can't turn them into fat cells without insulin. So you're growing these sort of primordial early versions of cells, the fibroblasts, that can have the potential to turn into all kinds of different cells. And we make them turn into fat cells by giving them insulin. So we have to treat them with insulin for a period of time, then we clear the insulin out, and then we started treating them with ketones to see what would happen. And then the control cells just would stay in the normal control medium. And what we find, the black bars, you'll see that we almost have, and I don't want to get into the details of what the conditions are, but I certainly would love to if any are interested. But just take it, for now, we'll just say it's mitochondrial function and respiration. But you'll see the overall trend, the black bars, the adipocytes that were fed ketones, not just the standard culture medium, a substantial increase, a doubling of the rate at which these cells are using oxygen. In other words, we are altogether, when ketones are up, fat cells begin shifting their actions. And they now are starting to use more energy in this uncoupled state, and they're less inclined to store energy. So we're shifting. The hormones, because of ketones, because insulin's low, we're starting to shift the use of energy, how the body's using it. And again, this is important for when we are trying to account for calories. So overall, the overall conclusions from this to this point are that Each of these molecules, insulin versus ketones, are having contrasting effects on the way our fat tissue is acting. In particular, if insulin has its way, what does it want to do to the adipocytes? It wants to shift it to be very, very white and not very storage mode and not using of energy. It wants to spare the energy and store it. In contrast, if ketones have its way, of course, then we're shifting it more towards a brown phenotype. It's acting more in this wasting. And again, this is all because of what we're doing to the mitochondria. The mitochondria that were once very coupled, that were only using as much energy as the cell is needing, now all of a sudden it's wasting it just to produce heat. It's like we just keep throwing logs on the fire because we want the fire just to get bigger and bigger. If uncoupling protein has its way, this is what's happening. And so again, it's a fundamental shift in how the adipocytes are using their energy. And in particular, it's an increase in energy. And again, just for the sake of producing heat. So everything I've shown you up to this point is sort of encompassed in this message right here. As we are shifting between insulin and ketones, one being high, one being low, because they are not meant to be high at the same time in a human. They're not meant to be low at the same time. These are contrasting. And that's relevant when it comes to supplements these days. But nonetheless, that's the sort of takeaway right now. And we'll bring it all together again in just a minute. But there's still one other point I wanted to mention, because I'd mentioned earlier that energy, the purists, when it comes to thermodynamics, will say, well, it has to be used or it has to be stored. But in fact, in this state, there's one more that too often we're overlooking, that even we, this community of low-carb, high-fat advocates, isn't really appreciating, I think. Some might be, but I don't think it's enough. And that's this idea of wasting, which is, I'm considering it distinct from using energy. In this case, wasting energy. So what do I mean by that? Let's go back to that initial paradigm where we looked at the two theories of obesity, of why we get fat, the caloric model and the endocrine model. I've already shown you now that in the endocrine model, we have this unique use of energy in the form of brown fat, where we are uncoupling the mitochondria just to produce heat, to use glucose just to fuel the fire. But in the case of the endocrine theory of obesity, we have another idea where we have another outlet of energy, and this is, in fact, in the form of ketones themselves. And you already know this. I imagine some of you already have come to this conclusion if you didn't know it already. And so if insulin is low in the human body, we are then turning acetyl-CoA into ketones. And then some of these, and remember, where's acetyl-CoA coming from? Appreciate this. It's coming from nutrients like predominantly lipid and carbohydrate. So we are literally taking pieces. If we look at a fat molecule, we've started cutting the fat molecule up into small pieces. And these pieces are acetyl-CoA, and then we convert them into ketones. So we're literally taking pieces of fat, turning it into ketones. And then what do we start doing it with it when we're in ketosis? We start breathing it out. And what else do we do? Yes, we start urinating it out. And so we appreciate what that means. And mind you, this is happening in a person, depending on the depth of ketosis, 5 to 20 times more than the average individual. So appreciate what that means. We're taking pieces of fat and we're just wasting it to the environment. Can you appreciate what that means? I mean, it's quite remarkable. We're breathing out fat and we're urinating out little pieces of fat. And this is, again, a reckoning, an accounting of energy that is quite unique to the endocrine theory. And this is why you start to have some wiggle room when it comes to you're a little in caloric excess and yet you can still lose more weight than someone else. It's because we have this wiggle room, this wasting of energy, not to mention the increased usage that I'd already shown you. This study from just a few years ago from David Ludwig's lab, putting people on 3 diets differing in macronutrient content, you'll notice the y-axis is similar to the y-axis that I showed you when we measured metabolic rate in the mice. They measured metabolic rate in the humans. And you'll see that metabolic rate was highest in the lowest carb group. But this was isocaloric, so they're eating the exact same number of calories, and yet their metabolic rate was the highest of all. Perhaps some evidence of increased usage. Increased uncoupling would account for increased oxygen use, which is really what that's measuring when they're looking at metabolic rate. This study is unique. It's interesting, and the title says it all. They put humans into 2 groups. One was the classic low-calorie, so a calorie-restricted, low-fat diet. The other was a calorie-unrestricted, low-carb diet. In other words, it was ad libitum. Eat however much you'd like. Now, what's interesting, in the end, they actually ended up eating about the same. As many of you know, you end up just controlling your appetite anyway. You're not going, it's not always bonanza and you're going crazy. You end up just self-regulating. And that's what happened here. The actual caloric consumption ended up being equal, even though one group was told you can eat as much as you'd like. What's relevant here is that the group that was told eat as much as you'd like, and they actually ate the same amount of calories, it was not statistically different between them, they lost over twice as much fat mass over the course of this study. But that shouldn't have happened, and even the authors acknowledge this. Because they were eating the same amount of calories, and yet one group lost 2.5 times more fat mass, they should have been eating less, but they weren't. And more evidence of this fact that there's some extra usage of energy or some degree of wasting, perhaps. Now let's flip it around. Those studies looked at lowering insulin. What happens if we increase insulin? So this study took equal body weight groups, type 2 diabetics, body weight matched with non-diabetics. And that in the original state, the metabolic rate in the type 2 diabetics was higher than the non-diabetics. And that might be for any number of reasons, but least of which could be that their insulin might have been lower than the other overweight non-diabetic. But what happens when you start the type 2 diabetic on insulin therapy? Their metabolic rate starts to significantly drop, and that's what they found. When the type 2 diabetics started insulin therapy, metabolic rate dropped. More evidence that there's some shift going on. And then the last study I want to show you, just as hints that are supporting this overall effect in humans, is this one, and I love this study. So let's just look at it. Don't let it be daunting at first glance. This took type 2 diabetics from month 0 when they were first beginning their insulin therapy. And so let's look at a few key things on this slide. So what's happening to their insulin dose over this 6 months? Do you see what's happening? The overall trend, their insulin dose is climbing. And that's very much reflective of this biological phenomenon that too much of something results in a desensitizing or a downregulation of the sensitivity to that something. In other words, hyperinsulinemia causing insulin resistance. So these type 2 diabetics are becoming more and more insulin resistant throughout the course, in just 6 months, mind you. Now what's happening to their body weight throughout the course? This is only 6 months. And they gain about 20 pounds of fat, and that's actually quite common among type 2 diabetics who begin insulin therapy. So a 20-pound gain. Now lastly, that's interesting so far, but what happens to the amount of food they're eating, or at least reporting? And I admit that's a potential problem. It's going down. So one of these variables, insulin dose or caloric consumption, is matching the overall change in body weight. Only one of them. So in the end, as we wrap this up and kind of bring this to a nice takeaway conclusion, again, there are 2 theories of why we get fat, the caloric and the endocrine theory. And very much among both of them, there's this insistence that energy must be stored or used. But in the case of the endocrine theory, which encompasses both of those, there's also that third option that we have to consider, which is energy can be wasted. Not wasted in a universal context, but in the human context, wasted from our bodies. And in the state where insulin is low, evidence I showed you suggests that we have a shift in how our fat tissue is acting. In particular, fat tissue is acting more uncoupled. It's acting more like brown adipose tissue, and there's relatively less overall activity of the white adipose tissue. And then the takeaway from that is, if there's less of adipose tissues acting less like white adipose tissue, then we're less inclined to store it. So there's a reduced inclination to store energy. And in contrast, because of the shift in fat tissue acting more uncoupled or more like brown fat tissue, there's an increase in the usage. But it's not because we're working more. This doesn't mean we're exercising more, because what are we using that energy for? It was for heat, yeah. So that's the thermoregulation aspect of brown fat. And then lastly, again, but separate from these previous 2, separate from brown fat, I just had to mention it, if insulin is low, ketogenesis is up, and now we have these little pieces of nutrients that we are wasting from the body in the form of expired breath and urination. So altogether, these overall factors is what leads me to fairly comfortably conclude that the caloric theory is very much encompassed within the endocrine theory. But you'll notice I'm trying to be diplomatic and say, well, there may be some things. So I'm leaving a sliver that is outside of that circle. And because as a scientist, I am seeking truth, and I acknowledge there may be some variables that I either haven't considered yet, and I just haven't seen it, or we just don't know yet. So I'm going to leave some of it on its own, just to respect our neighbors. Overall, this is what I believe, this overall series of events, a shift in how our fat tissue is behaving, a shift in how we are using energy in the form of wasting it with lost ketones. This is what I believe we should have in mind when we refer to the metabolic advantage that comes with a low-carb, high-fat diet. This overall metabolic environment within the body that allows us to not have to account for every individual calorie. And just when we can tell people and tell ourselves, eat when we're full, don't eat when we're not, we don't have to count calories. Because if we are a little excess, the body appears to be prepared to cope with that. And just because of this talk and the historic context we've seen, I just also wanted to mention this isn't a new idea. We have known this, and many of you are already very familiar with this, and you are all familiar if you've seen the previous talks. This is not a new idea. This has been around from the very beginnings of our considering why we get fat.